When George Strait met his biggest fan and discovered the true meaning of music, the fluorescent lights of the television studio backstage flickered with that familiar buzz that George Strait had grown accustomed to over his 5 decades in the music business. At 71 years old, the king of country music sat in a plastic chair that seemed too small for his legendary status, adjusting his signature black cowboy hat for what felt like the 100th time that evening. His weathered hands, which had strummed guitars in front of millions of screaming fans, now trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. "George, you sure about this?" his manager, Tom Richardson, asked for the 3rd time in 10 minutes, his voice carrying that tone of concern that had become all too familiar lately. "I mean, being a guest judge on American Dreams. This isn't exactly your usual venue." George's steel-gray eyes remained fixed on the monitor, showing the stage where a 17-year-old girl was butchering one of his classics. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a man who had dominated the country music charts for decades, watching kids half his age attempt to breathe life into songs he'd written when they were still in diapers. Some succeeded brilliantly. Others, like the current contestant, made him wonder if he should have retired years ago. "Tom, I've been asking myself the same question all day," George replied, his distinctive Texas drawl as smooth as aged whiskey despite his inner turmoil. "But maybe that's exactly why I need to be here. When was the last time I actually listened to what the next generation thinks about music? Really listened?" The truth George couldn't bring himself to voice was far more complicated. 3 months ago, during what was supposed to be a routine checkup, his doctor had delivered news that made even a man who'd faced the tragic loss of his 13-year-old daughter decades earlier feel vulnerable. Not life-threatening, but certainly life-changing. His hearing, the very foundation of his musical career, was beginning to deteriorate. The irony was cruel. Just as he was questioning his relevance in modern country music, his ability to even hear it properly was slipping away. "Ladies and gentlemen, our next contestant is a bit special tonight," the show's overly enthusiastic host announced to the live audience. "Please welcome Noah Mitchell, 15 years old, from Austin, Texas." George looked up from his coffee as applause rippled through the studio. On the monitor, he watched a painfully thin boy walk onto the stage, clutching an acoustic guitar that seemed to dwarf his frail frame. Something about the kid immediately caught George's attention, not just his obvious physical weakness, but the way he carried himself. There was a dignity in his posture, a quiet strength that reminded George of his own father, who had worked cattle ranches his entire life, without ever complaining about the back-breaking labor. If you're watching this story unfold with us tonight, we'd love to hear from you. Please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what you think will happen next, and tell us where you're watching from. Your support means everything to us as we share these incredible true stories. Noah positioned himself at the microphone with the careful movements of someone who understood that every gesture cost energy he couldn't afford to waste. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, yet somehow it carried clearly through the studio's sound system. "Hi everyone, my name is Noah Mitchell, and I'm 15 years old. 3 years ago, I was diagnosed with osteosarcoma, bone cancer. The doctors told my mom and me that I had maybe 6 months to live." A collective intake of breath swept through the audience, but Noah continued with remarkable composure. "That was 36 months ago. I've been through 17 surgeries, countless chemotherapy sessions, and more hospital stays than I can count." George felt his chest tighten. He'd seen plenty of hard-luck stories during his time in the music business, but something about this kid's matter-of-fact delivery hit him like a freight train. It wasn't self-pity or a plea for sympathy. It was simply the truth, delivered with the kind of acceptance that only comes from someone who stared death in the face and somehow found peace with it. "During my treatments," Noah continued, "there was one song that got me through the worst nights, when the pain was so bad I couldn't sleep, when I was so sick from the chemo that I couldn't keep anything down, when I wondered if I'd ever see another sunrise. There was this one song that reminded me why life was worth fighting for." The studio had fallen completely silent. Even the camera operators had stopped moving, afraid to break the spell this young man was casting over everyone present. "I'd like to sing Amarillo by Morning by George Strait," Noah said, and for the first time, his voice cracked slightly. "Mr. Strait, if you're watching this someday, I want you to know that your music saved my life in ways you'll never understand." George's coffee cup slipped from his suddenly numb fingers, clattering to the floor and sending liquid splashing across his boots. Tom reached over to steady him, But George was already rising from his chair, his eyes locked on the monitor as Noah began to tune his guitar. "Jesus, George, you okay?" Tom whispered. George couldn't answer. How could he explain that this kid, this dying kid who probably weighed less than his guitar, had just articulated something George had been struggling with for months? The question of whether his music mattered anymore, whether all those years of touring and recording and performing had actually touched people's lives in meaningful ways. Noah's fingers found the opening chords of Amarillo by Morning, and George felt a chill run down his spine. The kid wasn't playing it like a cover song or a tribute. He was playing it like a prayer, like a confession, like a last testament to everything he'd learned about life in his 15 short years. When Noah began to sing, George had to grip the back of his chair to keep from falling over. The voice that emerged from that frail body wasn't the voice of a sick child. It was the voice of someone who had walked through hell and somehow found beauty in the flames. Every word carried weight. Every note resonated with a truth that most professional singers spent their entire careers trying to capture. Amarillo by Morning, up from San Antone. Everything that I got is just what I got on... Noah sang, but he wasn't singing about losing everything in a card game or starting over after a failed romance. He was singing about losing his childhood to cancer treatments, about giving up dreams of playing high school football or going to prom, about finding strength in the simple act of waking up each day when your body is begging you to give up. George found himself moving toward the stage entrance without conscious thought, his manager calling after him, but he couldn't stop. This wasn't just a performance. It was a conversation between two souls separated by 56 years and countless miles, connected by the mysterious power of music to transform pain into beauty. The other judges, a pop star whose name George couldn't remember, and a Broadway veteran who'd been polite but dismissive during their brief introductions, were sitting forward in their chairs, completely captivated. In the audience, people were crying openly, including a woman in the front row whom George suddenly realized must be Noah's mother. As Noah reached the song's bridge, his voice grew stronger rather than weaker, as if the music itself was feeding him energy. George had heard thousands of renditions of his songs over the years, from amateur karaoke singers to world-class performers, but he had never heard anyone capture the essential loneliness and hope that he'd poured into those lyrics 35 years ago. When they ask him what he's going to do with his life, he just grins and says he's going to be a cowboy. Noah sang, but George knew he was really saying, "When they ask me what I'm going to do with the time I have left, I'm going to make music that matters." The final chord rang out through the studio, followed by a silence so complete that George could hear his own heartbeat. Then, as if released from a spell, the audience erupted in applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. People were on their feet, crying, cheering, reaching toward the stage as if they could somehow touch the magic Noah had just created. But George only had eyes for the boy at the microphone, who was now swaying slightly on his feet, the energy he'd summoned for the performance clearly depleting rapidly. In that moment, George Strait made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Breaking every protocol the producers had established, George strode onto the stage. The security guards moved to intercept George, but the show's director, recognizing the television gold unfolding before his eyes, frantically waved them off. Cameras swiveled to follow George's purposeful stride across the polished floor, his boots clicking with each determined step. In the control room, the producer was already calculating the viral potential of whatever was about to happen. Noah looked up with wide, disbelieving eyes as the legend himself approached. The boy's legs seemed ready to buckle. Whether from his medical condition or sheer overwhelming emotion, George couldn't tell. Without hesitation, George reached out and placed a steadying hand on Noah's shoulder. "Son," George said, his voice carrying clearly through the studio without need for a microphone. "That was the most honest version of my song I've ever heard." The audience held its collective breath. This wasn't scripted. This wasn't planned. This was pure, raw human connection happening in real time, broadcast to millions of homes across America. Noah's eyes filled with tears, but his voice remained steady. "Mr. Strait, I can't believe you're actually here. Your music, it's been my companion through everything. When the doctors told me the cancer had spread to my spine last year, I had all my exes live in Texas playing in my headphones during the MRI. It made me laugh, even though I was terrified." George felt his own throat constrict. The casual way Noah mentioned his spine being affected as if discussing the weather, revealed just how much this child had endured. "What's your prognosis now, Noah?" "Honestly, not great." Noah's matter-of-fact tone somehow made the words even more heartbreaking. "My oncologist, Dr. Rodriguez, she's amazing, but even she admits we're running out of options. The latest scans show the tumors are growing faster than the treatments can shrink them. She thinks maybe 3 months, maybe 6 if I'm lucky." The silence in the studio was deafening. George looked out at the audience, seeing his own anguish reflected in hundreds of faces. He thought of his daughter Jennifer, taken from him in that horrific car accident in 1986. She'd been 13, just 2 years younger than Noah was now. The pain of that loss had never fully healed, but it had taught him something invaluable about the preciousness of time and the importance of seizing meaningful moments. "Noah," George said, his voice growing stronger, "I've been in this business for over 40 years. I've worked with some of the greatest musicians who ever lived. I've heard thousands of singers, young and old, try to interpret my songs. But what you just did up here, that wasn't interpretation, that was transformation. You took my words and made them into something entirely new, something deeper than I ever imagined they could be." The pop star judge, Marcus Taylor, leaned forward in his chair, clearly moved despite his usual calculated coolness. "I have to agree with George. I've been judging talent competitions for 5 years and I've never seen anything like what just happened on this stage." But it was the third judge, Broadway veteran Catherine Morrison, who cut through the emotion with the cold precision of someone who'd spent decades in the entertainment industry. "It was certainly touching," she said, her tone suggesting she found the whole display a bit manipulative. "But let's be honest here. Are we judging this performance on its musical merit, or are we giving sympathy points? Because while the story is heartbreaking, this is ultimately a talent competition, not a charity event." The audience's mood shifted instantly. Murmurs of disapproval rippled through the crowd. George felt his jaw clench, a familiar anger building in his chest, the same protective fury he'd felt whenever someone had spoken carelessly about Jennifer's memory. Noah, however, seemed unsurprised by the comment. "She's not wrong," he said quietly, but his voice carried through the studio microphones. "I know what people think when they see me. Poor sick kid. Let's give him a participation trophy. I've dealt with that attitude my whole life since the diagnosis. Even at school, teachers would give me grades I didn't earn. Friends would invite me to things out of pity rather than genuine friendship." He adjusted his grip on his guitar, and George noticed the boy's hands were steadier than his own. "But, Ms. Morrison, I didn't come here for sympathy. I came here because I have something to say, and music is the only language I know how to say it in. Yeah, I'm dying, yeah. That affects how I sing. But isn't that true for all of us? Aren't we all dying, just at different speeds? The only difference is I know my timeline." Catherine Morrison's carefully constructed composure cracked slightly. That's very philosophical for someone so young. "You learn to grow up fast when you spend more time in hospitals than in classrooms," Noah replied. "But here's what I want you to understand. When I sing Mr. Strait's songs, I'm not performing them, I'm living them. Every word about loss, about starting over, about finding hope when everything seems hopeless. Those aren't just lyrics to me. They're my autobiography." George found himself nodding vigorously. "That's exactly right, son. That's what real country music has always been about. Taking life's hardships and finding the beauty in them, finding the universal truth that connects us all." Marcus Taylor stood up from his judge's table and walked toward the stage. "You know what? I'm a pop musician, not country. But what Noah just said about living the songs rather than performing them, that's what separates true artists from entertainers. I've worked with kids who can hit every note perfectly, but have never felt the emotion behind the words. Noah, you've felt more real emotion in 15 years than most people feel in a lifetime." Catherine Morrison remained seated, her arms crossed. "It's still a talent competition," she insisted. "Emotional authenticity doesn't automatically translate to commercial viability. This boy is clearly ill. What happens when sponsors and record labels have to deal with the reality of his condition? What happens when he's too sick to promote an album or tour? The music industry is a business, not a Make-A-Wish foundation." The harshness of her words sent a shockwave through the studio. Several audience members actually gasped audibly. Noah's mother, watching from the front row, covered her face with her hands. But Noah himself seemed to straighten up rather than shrink away. "You're absolutely right," Noah said, surprising everyone. "I probably won't live long enough to have a traditional music career, I'll never headline Madison Square Garden or sell millions of albums, but that doesn't mean my music doesn't have value. Some of the most beautiful songs ever written were created by people who knew they were dying. Johnny Cash's last album, Warren Zevon's The Wind. Sometimes knowing your time is limited makes every note count more. George felt a surge of admiration for this young man who was handling professional criticism with more grace than many seasoned performers. But Catherine Morrison wasn't finished. "That's a lovely sentiment," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "but this isn't a philosophy class. This is a talent show. And talent shows are about finding the next big star, not providing therapy sessions for terminally ill teenagers. I'm sorry to be harsh, but someone needs to inject some reality into this situation." That was the moment George Strait's legendary composure finally snapped. The same protective instinct that had made him fiercely guard his family's privacy for decades, the same paternal love that still grieved for his lost daughter, roared to life. He stepped forward, placing himself between Catherine Morrison and Noah like a shield. "Ma'am," George said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd commanded respect in honky-tonks and concert halls alike, "I've been in this business since before you could read music. I've seen talented kids come and go like tumbleweeds. I've watched the industry chew up and spit out performers who had all the commercial viability in the world, but nothing to say. And I've learned something that apparently you haven't. The measure of a musician isn't how many records they sell or how long they live. It's whether they can touch another human being's soul with their music." The studio was electric with tension. Cameras captured every micro-expression as one of country music's most respected figures prepared to defend a dying child against a judge's cruel pragmatism. "Noah just did something up here that most professional singers never accomplish in entire careers," George continued, his voice rising with passion. "He made my own song mean something new to me. He reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place. And if you can't see the value in that, then you have no business judging anyone's talent." Catherine Morrison's face flushed red. "Mr. Strait, I respect your legacy, but you're letting emotion cloud your judgment. This boy may sing beautifully, but—" "This boy," George interrupted, his eyes flashing with anger, "has more courage and authenticity than most of the manufactured acts that fill the charts today. And I'll tell you something else. If he's willing, I'd be honored to share a stage with him." The audience erupted in cheers, but George wasn't done. He turned to Noah, whose eyes were now streaming with tears of disbelief and gratitude. "Noah, would you do me the honor of singing one more song with me tonight?" Noah's guitar nearly slipped from his trembling hands. For a moment, he simply stared at George Strait, as if the legendary singer were an apparition that might vanish if he blinked. The audience held its breath, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented in television history. Mr. Strait, are you serious?" Noah's voice cracked with disbelief. "Do you want to sing with me?" "Son, I've never been more serious about anything in my life," George replied, his anger at Catherine Morrison transforming into something warmer, more protective. "But only if you feel up to it. I don't want to push you beyond what your body can handle." Noah straightened his shoulders with visible effort, and for a moment, the frail 15-year-old transformed into someone much older, someone who had learned to find strength in the darkest places. "What song?" George smiled, the first genuine smile he'd worn all evening. "How about The Chair? It's got a nice easy tempo, and I think our voices might complement each other well." The mention of one of George's biggest hits sent another wave of excitement through the audience. Even Catherine Morrison, still bristling from George's rebuke, leaned forward with grudging curiosity. This wasn't just a duet. This was a masterclass about to unfold. "I know every word," Noah said, his eyes brightening despite his obvious exhaustion. "I used to sing it to myself during the long nights in the hospital. The nurses said they could hear me humming it down the hallway." "Then let's show these folks what real music sounds like," George said, positioning himself beside Noah at the microphone. "You take the first verse, I'll harmonize. We'll trade off on the chorus." As Noah began the opening chords, George couldn't help but notice the kid's technique. Despite his physical weakness, his finger positioning was flawless, his timing impeccable. This wasn't someone who'd learned to play guitar as a hobby during cancer treatment. This was someone with genuine musical instincts. "Well, excuse me, but I think you've got my chair," Noah began, his voice stronger now, buoyed by George's presence beside him. The intimacy of the song, originally about meeting someone in a bar, took on new meaning coming from a boy who'd spent more time in hospital chairs than anywhere else. George joined in with a harmony so perfectly pitched that it seemed like they'd been singing together for years. Their voices, one weathered by decades of performing, the other young but marked by suffering, created a blend that was somehow both heartbreaking and triumphant. In the front row, Noah's mother, Sarah Mitchell, wept openly. She remembered the nights she'd sat beside her son's hospital bed, listening to him whisper sing George Strait songs when he thought she was asleep. She'd never imagined those private moments of comfort would lead to this incredible scene. As they moved into the chorus, something magical happened. Noah's voice, which had been tentative at the beginning of his solo performance, now soared with confidence. Having his musical hero beside him seemed to unlock a power he didn't know he possessed. The audience was on its feet again, but this time it wasn't just sympathy. It was genuine awe at the musical chemistry unfolding before their eyes. "No, that one's not taken. I'd be glad to share," they sang together, and the lyrics took on layers of meaning neither songwriter had originally intended. It wasn't just about sharing a chair in a bar. It was about sharing hope, sharing music, sharing the precious time that both singers knew was limited, though for different reasons. Marcus Taylor turned to Catherine Morrison during an instrumental break. "You still think this is just a pity party?" he whispered. Catherine's expression had softened considerably, though her professional skepticism remained. "I admit, they sound good together, but Marcus, we can't ignore the practical realities. This boy is dying." "So are we all," Marcus replied, echoing Noah's earlier words. "The difference is he's making every moment count." As the song built toward its climax, George made an impromptu decision that would be talked about in country music circles for years to come. Instead of sticking to the original arrangement, he stepped back from the microphone and let Noah take the final verse solo, serving as pure accompaniment on his own song. "And I was wondering if you might like to dance," Noah sang, his voice rising with an power that seemed impossible given his fragile frame. "We could go out on the floor, get some romance." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A boy who could barely stand was singing about dancing, about romance, about all the normal teenage experiences that cancer had stolen from him. Yet somehow, through the alchemy of music, those lost experiences were being transformed into something beautiful rather than bitter. George watched with amazement as Noah poured everything he had into that final verse. This wasn't just singing. This was a young man making his peace with life, celebrating what he'd had rather than mourning what he'd lost. In that moment, George understood why this performance was affecting him so profoundly. It reminded him of his own journey through grief after Jennifer's death, how music had been the only thing that made the pain bearable. The final chord rang out, and the silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the stunned quiet of surprise. This was the reverent hush of people who knew they'd witnessed something sacred. Then the applause began, and it was thunderous. People weren't just clapping, they were cheering, crying, holding each other. In the control room, hardened television professionals wiped their eyes while frantically calculating how to turn this moment into a recurring segment. George pulled Noah into an embrace, careful not to squeeze too tightly. Up close, he could feel how thin the boy was, could sense the weakness in his frame, but he could also feel something else, a strength that had nothing to do with physical health and everything to do with the power of music to transcend human limitations. "Son," George whispered in Noah's ear, "that was extraordinary. How are you feeling?" "Like I just lived a whole lifetime in 4 minutes," Noah whispered back, his voice hoarse from the emotional intensity of the performance. As they separated, George kept one protective arm around Noah's shoulders. He looked out at the judges' table, his gaze lingering on Catherine Morrison. "Still think this is just about sympathy?" he asked, his voice carrying clearly through the studio. Catherine Morrison stood up slowly, her earlier antagonism replaced by something closer to respect. "Mr. Strait, Noah, I owe you both an apology. I've been in this business long enough to become cynical about manufactured moments and emotional manipulation, but what I just witnessed," she paused, struggling to find the right words, "that was genuine artistry. Noah, you have a gift that transcends your circumstances." The audience murmured their approval, but Noah surprised everyone by addressing Catherine directly. "Ms. Morrison, you don't need to apologize for being honest about the business side of music. You're right, I probably won't have a traditional career. But maybe that's okay. Maybe my role isn't to be the next big star. Maybe it's just to remind people why music matters in the first place. George felt his respect for this young man grow even deeper. Despite everything he'd endured, Noah harbored no bitterness, no resentment toward those who doubted him. Instead, he displayed a wisdom and grace that put most adults to shame. "Noah," George said, making another spontaneous decision, "I meant what I said about being honored to share a stage with you, but I want to take it further than that. Would you be interested in coming to Nashville? Not for a record deal or a publicity stunt, but to spend some time making music together. Real music, the kind that comes from the heart." The offer hung in the air like a prayer. Noah looked out at the audience, then at his mother, whose tear-streaked face radiated both joy and terror at the prospect of her dying son embarking on such an adventure. "Mr. Strait," Noah said finally, "I'd follow you anywhere if it meant I could keep making music like this, but I have to be honest. My doctors say I need to stay close to home for treatments. I can't just pack up and move to Nashville." "Then we'll bring Nashville to you," George said without hesitation. "I've got a mobile studio set up. We can record anywhere. Austin's not that far from San Antonio. I can drive over whenever you're feeling up to it. We'll work around your treatment schedule. Go at whatever pace your body allows." The audience erupted again, but George wasn't finished. He turned to the cameras, addressing the millions of viewers watching at home. "Folks, I've been making music for over 40 years, and I thought I'd experienced everything this business had to offer. But tonight, this young man has taught me something I'd forgotten. That music isn't about charts or sales figures or industry politics. It's about connection. It's about finding the universal truths that bind us together as human beings. Noah, you've reminded me why I fell in love with country music in the first place." He paused, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "So, here's what we're going to do. Noah and I are going to make some music together, not for fame or profit, but because great music deserves to be shared. And if the good Lord's willing and the creek don't rise, maybe we'll have something special to show y'all in a few months." The studio erupted in chaos, audience members cheering, judges applauding, camera operators scrambling to capture every angle. But in the center of it all, George Strait and Noah Mitchell stood together, an unlikely pair united by their shared love of music and their understanding that sometimes the most powerful performances come from the most unexpected places. As the show's producers signaled for a commercial break, George leaned down to Noah one more time. "Are you ready for this adventure, son?" Noah's smile was radiant despite his exhaustion. "Mr. Strait, I've been ready my whole life." 3 weeks later, George Strait found himself driving his pickup truck through the tree-lined streets of Austin, Texas, a mobile recording studio trailing behind him like a modern-day covered wagon. The October morning was crisp, painted in the golden hues that made Texas autumns legendary. But George's mind wasn't on the scenery. It was on the phone call he'd received from Sarah Mitchell the night before. "Mr. Strait, I need to be honest with you," Noah's mother had said, her voice strained with exhaustion and worry. "Noah's been having some rough days since the show. The excitement took more out of him than we expected. Dr. Rodriguez had to increase his pain medication, and he's been sleeping about 16 hours a day. I don't want you to make this trip if he's not going to be able to give you his best." George had listened to the concern in her voice, remembering his own desperate attempts to protect Jennifer from anything that might cause her pain or disappointment. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm not coming to Austin expecting Noah to perform miracles. I'm coming because I made a promise to a remarkable young man, and I intend to keep it. Even if all we do is sit and talk about music, it'll be time well spent." Now, as he pulled into the driveway of the modest 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood near South Austin, George could see why Sarah had been worried. The house looked like it belonged to a family that had been through an extended crisis. The lawn needed attention, paint was peeling from the shutters, and there was a wheelchair ramp that had been hastily constructed leading to the front door. Sarah Mitchell met him at the door before he could knock. She was younger than George had expected, probably in her early 40s, but her face carried the worn expression of someone who'd been fighting an impossible battle for too long. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore scrubs that suggested she'd either just returned from work or was about to leave for another shift. "Mr. Strait, I can't believe you're actually here," she said, her voice mixing gratitude with barely controlled emotion. "Noah's been awake since 5 this morning, which is unusual for him lately. I think he's been running on pure adrenaline since he heard your truck pull up. Please, call me George," he said, removing his hat as he stepped inside. The house was small but immaculately clean, with medical equipment discreetly placed throughout the living room. What struck George most, however, were the guitars. At least 6 different acoustic guitars of various sizes, all meticulously maintained and positioned around the room like pieces of furniture. "Noah collects them," Sarah explained, noticing George's attention. "Or he did before the medical bills started piling up. We've had to sell 3 of his favorites over the past year, but I couldn't bring myself to let him sell them all. Music is literally the only thing that keeps him going some days." George felt a familiar tightness in his chest. He thought of his own collection of guitars, worth more than most people's houses, sitting in climate-controlled cases in his Nashville mansion. Where is he now? In his room, tuning his favorite guitar for probably the 100th time this morning. He's nervous, which is actually a good sign. It means he's feeling well enough to care about making a good impression. As they walked down a hallway lined with family photos, George noticed how the pictures told the story of Noah's battle. Early photos showed a healthy, athletic-looking boy with bright eyes and a mischievous grin. As the timeline progressed, the changes were subtle at first. A slight thinness, a more serious expression, then became more dramatic. The most recent photos showed the Noah that George recognized from the television show, but they also revealed something the cameras hadn't fully captured: the unwavering love and support of a mother who refused to let her son face his battle alone. Sarah knocked gently on a door decorated with faded stickers of country music stars. "Noah, honey, your friend George is here. Come in." The voice from inside was stronger than George had expected, filled with genuine excitement. George entered a room that was part teenage bedroom, part music studio, part medical facility. Band posters covered the walls. George was both humbled and amused to see that he was prominently featured alongside newer artists like Chris Stapleton and Casey Musgraves. A hospital bed dominated one corner, surrounded by IV stands and monitoring equipment, but the rest of the space was dedicated to music. Sheet music was scattered across a desk, a keyboard sat in one corner, and several guitars hung on wall mounts. Noah was sitting in a comfortable chair by the window, cradling a beautiful Martin acoustic guitar that George recognized as a high-end model worth several $1,000s. The boy looked smaller than he had on television, more fragile, but his eyes held the same intense focus that had captured George's attention 3 weeks earlier. "Mr. Strait, George, I still can't believe you're actually here in my bedroom," Noah said, carefully setting the guitar aside to stand up. The effort required was obvious, but he managed it with dignity. "Wouldn't be anywhere else, son," George replied, meaning every word. "That's a beautiful guitar you've got there. Is that the one you played on the show?" "No, this is my pride and joy. A 1978 Martin D28 that belonged to my grandfather. He was a session musician in Nashville back in the day. Played backup for some pretty big names. When he passed away 5 years ago, he left it to me with strict instructions that it was never to be sold, no matter what." George's eyebrows rose. "Your grandfather was a Nashville session player. What was his name?" "Robert Mitchell, but everyone called him Bobby. He probably wasn't famous enough for you to know him, but Mom has some old session sheets that show he played on recordings for George Jones, Tammy Wynette, even some early Hank Williams Jr. stuff." "Bobby Mitchell?" George's voice carried a note of disbelief. "Son, Bobby Mitchell played on 3 of my early albums. He was one of the finest guitar players I ever worked with. Quiet as church mouse. But when he played, magic happened." Noah's eyes widened. "You knew my grandfather?" "Knew him? Hell, I learned half my guitar technique from watching Bobby work. He had this way of finding exactly the right notes to support a vocal without ever getting in the way. I was devastated when I heard he'd passed. I had no idea he had a grandson who inherited his musical gifts." Sarah Mitchell gasped from the doorway. "Mr. Strait, you have no idea what this means to us. Bobby always said he'd played with some big names, but we thought he might have been exaggerating a little. Noah grew up hearing stories about the good old days in Nashville studios." George shook his head in amazement. "Mrs. Mitchell, your father-in-law was a legend among musicians, even if the general public never knew his name. The fact that Noah has inherited that guitar, and more importantly, Bobby's musical instincts, explains a lot about what I heard on that television show." Noah carefully picked up the Martin again, his thin fingers finding familiar positions on the fretboard. "Would you like to hear something I've been working on? It's not finished yet, but I've been trying to write a song about everything that's happened over the past few weeks." "I'd be honored," George said, settling into a chair that Sarah quickly provided. Noah began to play, and immediately George could hear Bobby Mitchell's influence in the finger-picking style. But what emerged was entirely Noah's own creation, a haunting melody that seemed to capture both pain and hope in equal measure. "I never thought I'd see my name in lights," Noah sang, his voice clear despite his physical weakness. "Never thought I'd stand on a stage so bright, but sometimes life gives you more than you planned when a stranger becomes a friend and lends a helping hand." George felt chills run down his arms. This wasn't just a song, it was Noah's testimony, his way of processing the incredible turn his life had taken. The melody was sophisticated, the lyrics mature beyond the boy's years, yet the emotion was utterly authentic. "The doctors say my time is running short," Noah continued, "but I've learned that time ain't measured by the hours in a day. It's measured by the moments that take your breath away and the people who choose to love you anyway." As the song progressed, George realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. Noah wasn't just writing about his experience with cancer. He was writing about the universal human experience of facing mortality, of finding meaning in limited time, of discovering that love and art can transcend physical limitations. When Noah finished, the room was quiet, except for the soft hum of medical equipment. Sarah was crying silently in the doorway, and George found himself struggling to find words adequate to the moment. "Noah," he finally said, "that's one of the most beautiful songs I've ever heard. And I'm not saying that because of your situation. I'm saying it because you've captured something that most songwriters spend their entire careers trying to express." "Really?" Noah's voice was small, uncertain. "Really. In fact, I'd like to propose something. What if we worked on finishing that song together? Not because it needs fixing, but because I think it could be the centerpiece of something bigger. An album, maybe. Something that tells your story, but also speaks to everyone who's ever faced impossible odds." Noah's eyes lit up with an enthusiasm that seemed to energize his entire frail body. "You want to make an album with me? I want to make an album with you," George confirmed. "We'll take our time, work around your treatment schedule, and create something that honors both your grandfather's legacy and your own unique voice." Sarah stepped into the room, her face a mixture of joy and concern. "George, that sounds wonderful, but I have to ask, and what happens when Noah can't continue? I don't want him to start something he might not be able to finish." George turned to face her, his expression serious but kind. "Mrs. Mitchell, none of us know how much time we have. I could walk out of here today and get hit by a truck. The question isn't whether we'll have time to finish everything we start. It's whether we're brave enough to start the things that matter most." He looked back at Noah, who was clutching his grandfather's guitar like a lifeline. "Son, are you ready to make some music that'll outlast both of us?" 6 months later, the Grand Ole Opry House buzzed with an energy that veteran performers recognized as something special. Word had spread through Nashville's tight-knit music community that George Strait was making a rare Opry appearance, but what had the industry truly electrified was the rumor that he wouldn't be performing alone. The mysterious young man who'd captured America's heart on national television would be joining him for what many believed might be their final performance together. Dr. Elena Rodriguez sat in the third row, her medical bag discreetly tucked under her seat, and her pager set to silent. As Noah's oncologist, she'd insisted on being present for what everyone assumed would be an emotionally and physically taxing evening for her patient. What she hadn't told Noah, Sarah, or even George was the contents of the medical file sitting in her hotel room. Test results that defied everything she'd learned in 20 years of practicing oncology. Sarah Mitchell paced nervously backstage, her hands trembling as she adjusted Noah's collar for the 10th time in 5 minutes. Over the past half-year, she'd watched her son transform in ways that went beyond the music they'd been creating together. The constant pain that had been his companion for 3 years had gradually diminished. His appetite had returned. Most mysteriously, the crushing fatigue that had limited him to a few hours of consciousness each day had lifted, replaced by an energy that reminded her of the boy he'd been before cancer entered their lives. "Mom, I'm fine," Noah said gently, catching her hands in his. "Look at me." Sarah did look, and what she saw made her breath catch. Noah was still thin, still bore the physical marks of his long battle, but there was something different about him tonight. His eyes were clear and bright. His skin had lost the grayish pallor that had worried her for months, and when he moved, It was with a fluid grace she hadn't seen since he was 12 years old. "The scans from last week," she began tentatively. Dr. Rodriguez seemed surprised by something. She kept asking if you'd been taking any new medications, following any different treatment protocols. Noah's smile was mysterious. "Mom, I've been following the same treatment I've been on for months. Music therapy, with the best teacher I could ask for. Maybe that's more powerful medicine than anyone realized." In his own dressing room down the hall, George Strait was having his own moment of reflection. The album they'd completed just 2 weeks earlier, Borrowed Time, had already been hailed by critics as a masterpiece that bridged generational gaps in country music. But more than the professional success, George found himself marveling at the changes he'd witnessed in Noah throughout their collaboration. The frail, dying boy he'd met on that television show had gradually transformed into something approaching a normal teenager. Not completely. Noah still carried himself with the careful awareness of someone who'd learned not to take physical health for granted, but the desperate fragility was gone, replaced by a quiet strength that seemed to grow with each song they recorded together. Tom Richardson knocked on George's door. "5 minutes, George, you ready for this?" "Tom, I've been ready for this moment since I first heard that kid sing," George replied, adjusting his black hat one final time. "Tonight feels different, though. Like we're not just performing, we're celebrating something. The album's success. No, something bigger than that. Something I can't quite put my finger on." As showtime approached, the Opry's backstage manager, veteran performer Jake Williams, gathered the technical crew for a final briefing. "Listen up, folks. We're about to witness something special tonight. I don't know what's happened during those months of recording sessions, but that Mitchell kid is not the same person who walked into George's studio 6 months ago. His voice has gained power, his stage presence is commanding, and frankly, he moves like someone who's forgotten he's supposed to be sick." The lights dimmed in the historic auditorium, and the legendary voice of the Opry announcer filled the space. "Ladies and gentlemen, performing songs from their new album Borrowed Time, please welcome to the Grand Ole Opry stage, George Strait and Noah Mitchell." The audience erupted as George walked onto the stage, but the applause became thunderous when Noah appeared beside him. Gone was the wheelchair that many had expected. Gone was the hesitant, careful movement of someone guarding against pain. Noah walked with confidence, carrying his grandfather's Martin guitar with easy familiarity, his smile radiant under the stage lights. Dr. Rodriguez leaned forward in her seat, her medical training warring with what her eyes were telling her. The young man on stage bore little resemblance to the terminal cancer patient she'd been treating for 3 years. His posture was straight, his movements fluid, his color healthy. She thought of the test results locked in her hotel safe, scans that showed tumors reduced to barely detectable shadows, blood work that indicated an immune system functioning at levels she'd never seen in any of her cancer patients. "Good evening, Nashville," Noah called out to the crowd, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium without strain. "6 months ago, I was just a kid with a guitar and a dream, convinced I was living on borrowed time. Tonight I'm standing on the most famous stage in country music, next to my hero and friend, feeling like I've got all the time in the world." George stepped to his microphone. "Folks, when I first met Noah Mitchell, I thought I was going to teach him something about music. Instead, he taught me something about life. Over the past 6 months, I've watched this young man defy every expectation, overcome every obstacle, and remind all of us why we fell in love with country music in the first place." They opened with "Amarillo by Morning," the song that had brought them together, but this version was different from both the original recording and Noah's solo performance on the talent show. This was a conversation between two artists who'd found in each other not just musical compatibility, but a shared understanding of what it meant to face life's challenges with grace and determination. As they performed, Sarah Mitchell watched from the wings, with tears streaming down her face. Not tears of sadness for her dying son, but tears of joy for a young man who seemed to be discovering life rather than preparing for death. The set continued with songs from their new album, each one telling part of Noah's story, but speaking to universal themes of resilience, hope, and the healing power of human connection. When they performed Noah's original composition, More Than I Planned, the entire audience seemed to hold its breath, recognizing they were hearing something that would be remembered as a classic decades from now. But it was during the final song that the evening's most extraordinary moment occurred. As they began their duet version of The Chair, Noah stepped away from his microphone and began to move around the stage with an energy that seemed impossible given his medical history. He wasn't just performing, he was celebrating, his body language expressing a joy that transcended the lyrics they were singing. Dr. Rodriguez found herself standing up without conscious thought, her medical mind racing to process what she was witnessing. This wasn't the gradual improvement that sometimes occurred in cancer patients during remission. This was something else entirely, a transformation that challenged everything she understood about his condition. As the final notes faded, George and Noah stood together at center stage, the older man's arm around the younger one's shoulders. The applause was deafening, but George raised his hand for quiet. "Folks, I have an announcement to make," George said, his voice thick with emotion. Earlier today, Dr. Rodriguez shared some test results with Noah and his family, results that none of us expected, but all of us hoped for. The auditorium fell silent, every person present sensing they were about to hear something remarkable. Noah stepped forward to his microphone. "3 days ago, I had what my doctors thought would be my final set of scans before beginning hospice care. We were all prepared for bad news. Instead, Dr. Rodriguez told me something I never thought I'd hear." He paused, his eyes finding his mother in the wings, then Dr. Rodriguez in the audience, then settling on George beside him. "The tumors are gone. Not shrinking, gone. My blood work is normal. My bone marrow is healthy. For the first time in 3 years, I am officially cancer-free." The explosion of joy that erupted from the audience was unlike anything the Grand Ole Opry had ever experienced. People were on their feet, crying, cheering, embracing strangers. On stage, George pulled Noah into a fierce hug as both of them wept openly. Dr. Rodriguez made her way backstage, her mind still reeling from the medical impossibility she'd been documenting over the past several months. As a scientist, she couldn't explain what had happened to Noah Mitchell. As a human being, she didn't need to. Later that evening, as the crowds dispersed and the lights dimmed, Noah sat alone on the edge of the Opry stage, his legs dangling over the side like any normal teenager. George found him there, still processing the magnitude of the day's revelations. "How are you feeling, son?" George asked, settling beside him on the stage. "Grateful," Noah replied simply. "Grateful for the music, grateful for this friendship, grateful for time I never thought I'd have, but also a little scared." "Scared of what?" "Of forgetting, of taking this second chance for granted, of not living up to the miracle I've been given." George smiled, the wisdom of his years evident in his weathered features. "Noah, the fact that you're worried about those things tells me you're going to do just fine. You've already shown more courage and grace than most people manage in a full lifetime. Now you get to find out what you're capable of with a full lifetime ahead of you." Noah looked out at the empty auditorium, where just hours before thousands of people had witnessed something that would become legend in country music history. "George, do you think the music we made together somehow helped heal me?" "I don't know about that, son, but I do know that music has always been about healing. Healing broken hearts, healing broken spirits, healing the broken places in all of us. Maybe, just maybe, we tapped into something bigger than both of us." Noah nodded, understanding passing between them without need for further words. As they sat together in the hallowed silence of the empty Opry house, both men knew they'd been part of something extraordinary. Not just a musical collaboration, but a testament to the power of human connection to transcend even the most impossible circumstances. 2 years later, Noah Mitchell would graduate from high school on time, having made up all the classes he'd missed during his illness. He'd go on to study music therapy at Belmont University, inspired to help other young people find healing through music. George Strait would continue performing, but would later say that his collaboration with Noah had rekindled his love for music in ways that would sustain him for the rest of his career. Their album Borrowed Time would win the Grammy Award for Best Country Album, but more importantly, it would inspire a generation of young people to pursue their dreams, regardless of the obstacles they faced. The Noah Mitchell Foundation, established with the album's proceeds, would provide music therapy programs for children in hospitals across the country. But on this night, sitting together on the stage where country music history had been made for nearly a century, they were simply a man and a young person who had found in each other proof that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places, and that the human spirit, when coupled with the healing power of music, is capable of miracles that science cannot explain, but the heart readily accepts.